Some say dogs don't remember, but I believe the heart never forgets. Not the scent of home, nor the voice of someone who once whispered, "You're safe now." Welcome to Veil Marks, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Today's video is a deeply moving journey about loyalty, hope, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his lost Pitbull, Rusty. As the old saying goes, faith is seeing light with your heart when all your eyes see is darkness. This is more than just a story. It's a lesson in love that transcends time. Watch until the very end, because the final moment will stay with you long after the screen fades. The wind outside howled like a restless spirit, brushing up against the frosted windows of the Golden Haven shelter. Winter in rural Nebraska wasn't gentle. It came biting at the bones, settling in deep and quiet. Snow had begun to pile along the fence line, the sky a heavy sheet of gray, pressing low over the land. Inside the shelter, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and worn wool blankets. Only the rhythmic hum of an old wall fan and the occasional bark of a lonely dog broke the stillness. Walter Mays sat at the front desk, hunched in his chair like a weathered tree bent under years of wind. At 71, Walter didn't move like he used to. His joints creaked, his back complained, but the ache that truly lingered was somewhere deeper, somewhere unreachable by medicine. Since Martha passed 5 winters ago, the shelter had become his anchor. The routine kept his hands busy, and more importantly, it kept his heart just distracted enough not to sink entirely. Every morning was the same: feed the dogs, check the pens, write in the intake logs. But that morning, as he reached for the stack of mail half-heartedly tossed through the front slot, something odd caught his eye. Amid a pile of vet supply catalogs and donation flyers was a small envelope. Handwritten, no return address. The ink had smudged slightly in the damp, but the words were still legible. "To Rusty," it read. Walter blinked. He turned it over in his gnarled hands, uncertain. It wasn't unusual to get the occasional letter addressed to a dog, usually from former owners asking about a pup they'd surrendered. But this? There was no sender, no stamp. Just those 3 words, carefully printed in what looked like the scrawl of a child. Curiosity pulled him in. He slid a letter opener through the top and unfolded the page inside. It was short, just 1 sentence. "Tell Rusty I still believe he's coming home." Walter sat very still. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow ticking of the clock above the door. Then, without fully understanding why, he looked over his shoulder, past the swinging doors, down the hall to Kennel 4. Rusty. The Pitbull had been with them for almost 6 months now. Found wandering alone near Highway 83, his ribs showing through his short brindle coat, paws torn from gravel and ice. Walter remembered the day clearly. The dog had refused to approach the rescue workers, had cowered under an old rusted trailer until they lured him out with a turkey sandwich. They hadn't been able to trace any microchip, no collar, no tags. Just a scar along his back leg and eyes that watched every movement with quiet suspicion. Rusty hadn't barked once in the first 2 weeks. Even now, he remained distant, gentle but wary, always listening, always waiting, as if expecting someone who never came. Walter had grown fond of him in a quiet sort of way. There was something familiar in that dog's stillness, a knowing in those eyes that felt too human. The way he flinched at loud noises, the way he stayed close to corners. It reminded Walter of things he rarely let himself think about. A long time ago, during a different life under a different sun, Walter had worked with dogs like Rusty. Only those ones wore vests and had names like Sergeant and Bravo. He still dreamed some nights of his last mission in the service, of the explosion, of blood on concrete, of the German shepherd named Axel who'd pulled him from fire and didn't make it back. Walter closed his eyes for a second, clutching the note in his hand. "Tell Rusty I still believe he's coming home." He stood up slowly, letter in hand, and shuffled down the hallway. The kennels were quiet except for the occasional shuffle of paws or soft whines from dogs half asleep. When he reached Rusty's pen, the dog was lying on his blanket, eyes open, head resting on crossed paws. "Hey there, buddy," Walter said, voice low and steady. Rusty's ears perked slightly, but he didn't move. Walter crouched down with a wince, the old bones protesting. He held up the letter. "This here's for you." Rusty tilted his head. Walter read the note aloud, slowly, each word floating in the air between them like a promise. "Tell Rusty I still believe he's coming home." The Pitbull lifted his head. For the first time in weeks, he stood and walked to the front of the kennel. He didn't wag his tail, not exactly. But there was a shift, an alertness. Something like recognition stirred behind those amber eyes. Walter exhaled deeply. Something about that one sentence had cracked open a space in the silence, a little light cutting through the gray. He looked down at the letter again, then tucked it gently into his shirt pocket. "You've got someone out there," he murmured. "Someone who didn't forget you." That night, instead of turning off the lights early and locking up with his usual tired routine, Walter stayed an extra hour. He made a fresh blanket for Rusty's bed. He left a bit of roast beef from his own dinner in the food bowl. And just before leaving, he paused at the door and looked back. There was something different in the air. Not quite joy, not quite sorrow, but hope. And for the first time in a long while, Walter let himself believe too. The second letter came exactly 7 days later. It was tucked in the same kind of small envelope, same childlike handwriting, same absence of a return address. Walter found it waiting by the front door just after sunrise, slipped under the mat as if placed by a ghost in the night. This time, the letter began differently. "Hi, Rusty. I had apple pie today. Do you remember the one we used to share on the porch? I always gave you the last bite even when Mom said I shouldn't. Do you still like apple pie?" Walter stood in the kitchen, mug of black coffee going cold in his hand as he read the note aloud. A small smile crept across his worn face. He could almost hear the boy's voice. Gentle, hopeful, believing. Each word felt like it had been written with love instead of ink. He glanced down the hall toward the kennels. Rusty had been up early, pacing more than usual. The Pitbull had always been quiet. One of those dogs who didn't beg for attention, didn't bark for treats. He simply existed, watching the world with an air of quiet longing. But lately, something had shifted. He'd begun sitting up at odd times, looking toward the door like he was listening for something. Or someone. Walter walked down the hallway and stopped in front of Rusty's pen. The dog was lying on his side, eyes open. When Walter spoke, Rusty rose slowly and trotted to the gate. "I got another letter for you, boy," Walter said, unfolding the page. As he read, Rusty's ears lifted. His tail swayed once, then again. When Walter mentioned the apple pie, Rusty let out a soft huff, almost like a sigh. "You remember, don't you?" Walter whispered. Over the next few weeks, the letters came like clockwork, always on the same day, always handwritten. Each note told a different little story. Sometimes it was about school or a game the boy played alone in the backyard. Other times it was about memories, the way Rusty used to steal socks and hide them under the couch, or how he would bark at the mailman but only after he'd already driven away. They were short, sometimes rambling, and always addressed directly to Rusty. And every time Walter read them aloud, Rusty responded. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a tilt of the head. Then came the tail wags, the soft, whiny sounds he hadn't made in months. One morning, after a particularly sweet letter about how Rusty used to sleep curled up at the foot of the boy's bed, the dog nudged Walter's hand and licked his fingers. That night, Walter sat at his old oak desk and opened a blank notebook. On the cover, he wrote in pencil, "Letters to Rusty." Inside, he began to write down the dates and the contents of each letter, along with Rusty's reactions. But soon the notebook became more than just a log. It became a space for Walter's own thoughts, his reflections, memories, and things he hadn't said out loud in years. Page after page, Walter poured himself into those entries. He wrote about Martha, how she would have loved Rusty. He wrote about Axel, his old military dog who'd saved his life more than once overseas. He wrote about the quiet ache that filled his house at night, and how Rusty, somehow, had made it a little less unbearable. "Funny," he wrote one night, "how a child's letter to a dog can pull a man back to life." The shelter staff noticed the change, too. Walter, who used to be mostly silent during shift changes, began telling stories about Rusty's progress. He even brought in a second-hand quilt from his attic for the dog's bedding. "He deserves something soft," he'd said. One of the younger volunteers, a college student named Riley, asked Walter why he kept the letters instead of trying to track down who sent them. Walter simply replied, "Because whoever's sending them isn't ready to be found, but they're keeping a promise, and Rusty knows it." Some nights Walter would sit beside Rusty's pen long after closing time. He'd hum old tunes from the radio, talk about the weather, or just sit in silence while Rusty leaned against the bars. There was something comforting in the presence of that dog, something grounding. And while Rusty still wasn't the most energetic dog in the shelter, he had changed. He met Walter at the door now. He waited patiently during feeding time instead of staying curled in his corner. He even began responding to his name again, lifting his head with a little sparkle in his eyes whenever Walter called him. There was no denying it. Something real was happening. A bond was forming, not just between a man and a dog, but between three souls linked by paper, patience, and unspoken love. For Walter, those letters were more than messages. They were lifelines. Each envelope, each crooked line of childish script reminded him that even in a world where people rushed past each other without looking up, someone still believed. Someone still remembered. And that belief was enough to keep both Rusty and Walter moving forward. He didn't know who the boy was. He didn't know where the letters came from, or how the sender knew Rusty was here. But he didn't need to. Some things didn't require explanation. Some things, like faith, memory, and the love between a child and a dog, just needed to be felt. And as long as those letters kept coming, Walter would be there every week, sitting with Rusty, reading each word out loud like a prayer. Before he became a quiet shadow in Kennel 4, before his name was read from handwritten letters like a secret spell, Rusty had another life, one far from the humming lights and cold floors of the shelter. He'd been born in the backwoods of northern Kansas, one of 6 pups left inside a cardboard box at the edge of a dirt road. The box had tipped sideways, spilling the puppies into a shallow ditch. Most didn't make it, but Rusty, just a shivering, wide-eyed little Pitbull with a white patch on his chest, was found by a boy no older than 8, riding his bike on a late summer afternoon. That boy was Jonah. Jonah had been riding home from school when he spotted movement in the grass. At first he thought it was a raccoon. Then he heard the softest whimper. Dropping his bike, he crawled toward the sound and saw Rusty, mud-covered, hungry, and half-hidden in the weeds. Without hesitation, the boy lifted the trembling puppy into his arms, pressed him to his chest, and whispered, "It's okay now. I got you." That moment sealed something between them. From then on, Rusty was never just a dog. He was Jonah's shadow, his guardian, his secret keeper. They grew up together on a small plot of land where Jonah's mom worked double shifts and his dad fixed cars out of their garage. Theirs wasn't a wealthy life, but it was rich in things that mattered. Quiet mornings, muddy shoes, bare feet, and the sound of laughter shared between boy and dog. Rusty loved chasing butterflies through the cornfields. He loved lying beside Jonah at night, his head tucked under the boy's arm. And more than anything, he loved protecting his boy. Once, when Jonah wandered too far behind the shed and nearly stepped on a rattlesnake, Rusty was there. The dog lunged before the snake could strike, snapping its body mid-coil. He took a bite to the leg for his trouble. The scar never quite faded, and neither did the memory. But Rusty's fierce loyalty didn't win everyone over. Neighbors would cross the street when they saw Jonah walking him. Whispers about those pit bulls circulated the town like wildfire. One man went so far as to tell Jonah's mother that the dog should be put down before something terrible happens. It didn't matter that Rusty had never growled at a soul, that he was more afraid of the vacuum than he was of people. The word Pitbull did more damage than the dog ever could. Still, the family held on to him. Jonah's parents saw what others refused to see, that Rusty was gentle, sensitive even. He flinched at raised voices and hated thunderstorms. He didn't fight other dogs. He didn't chew shoes or destroy furniture. He only wanted to be close to Jonah. That's all. But everything changed the night the storm came. It had been a late spring squall, the kind that moved in fast and violent. The sky turned green. The wind howled like a freight train. Thunder rattled the windows, and Jonah screamed for Rusty, who had darted outside moments before the worst of it hit. They searched for hours in the pouring rain, calling his name through sheets of wind. Jonah's father drove up and down the gravel roads with the headlights cutting into the dark, while Jonah ran barefoot through the muddy fields with a flashlight in hand. But Rusty was gone. They searched for days, then weeks. Posters were hung, shelters were called. Jonah wrote a letter to the local paper. His mom offered a reward, but no trace of Rusty ever turned up. What the family didn't know was that Rusty had run in terror, confused by the sirens and thunder, trying to get back home and always ending up farther away. Each passing day pulled him further from the life he knew, and the world outside was not kind. Rusty learned quickly that not every hand reaching for him meant safety. He was chased away from porches with brooms. He was nearly hit by cars more than once. One night, starving and desperate, he tried to eat from a garbage bag outside a diner and bit into glass from a broken bottle. The pain made him howl for the first time since leaving Jonah. After that, something hardened in Rusty. He no longer approached strangers. He avoided bright lights. He walked in shadows and slept beneath porches when he could. Only children, when they passed by, made him pause. He would stop, tail low, head tilted, watching them with soft eyes, as if hoping one of them might be Jonah. When rescue workers finally found him along the side of a highway, he was barely recognizable, thin, wounded, exhausted. But even then, he didn't lash out. He didn't snarl. He simply laid down in the grass, his body surrendering not from fear but from sheer loss. Now, in the quiet safety of the Golden Haven shelter, Rusty lived like a ghost of the dog he once was, but something in him had survived. Something delicate. It flickered behind his eyes every time Walter read a letter, or when a child passed through the shelter and he stood up, ears perked just in case. Beneath the muscle and the scars under the label of dangerous breed was a heart shaped entirely by love, a heart still hoping, still searching, a heart that remembered the sound of a boy's laugh and the taste of apple pie on a sunny porch. Rusty wasn't broken. He was waiting for home. Jonah Reynolds wasn't like most 9-year-old boys. While other kids his age raced their bikes through puddles, played video games until bedtime, or filled playgrounds with laughter, Jonah was often found hunched over a kitchen table under dim light, carefully folding a letter and sliding it into an envelope. His handwriting was crooked and smudged in places, the words simple, but each letter carried a piece of his heart. Every week, always on Sunday night, he wrote to Rusty. It had been 5 months since Rusty disappeared, swept away during that terrible storm. Jonah remembered it like it had happened yesterday. The crashing thunder, the porch door flapping wildly in the wind, and the last glimpse of Rusty's tail disappearing into the darkness. He hadn't said goodbye. Jonah's mom, Melanie, worked 2 nursing shifts back-to-back at the county hospital. Most days, Jonah was up before she came home and asleep before she got back again. But even in her exhaustion, Melanie noticed the change in her son. The once bright, outgoing boy had grown quiet. His backpack stayed untouched in the corner. He stopped inviting friends over. He spent long hours tracing red and blue lines on a worn state map, circling towns, writing down the names of animal shelters in a spiral notebook. Then came the letters. At first, Melanie thought they were school assignments. Then she saw the envelopes, dozens of them, addressed to places all across Nebraska, some hundreds of miles away. One night, she gently asked, "Jonah, what are these letters for?" He looked up at her, eyes serious in a way that tugged at her chest. "They're for Rusty," he said plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "If he's out there, someone might read them to him." Melanie didn't have the heart to argue. She'd already tried to explain, gently, that Rusty might not come back, that sometimes, even when we love someone deeply, they don't always find their way home. But Jonah wasn't listening then. He wasn't listening now. He believed. And belief, to him, wasn't something fragile. It was a lifeline. In Jonah's room, on the nightstand beside his bed, sat Rusty's old collar. The tag had long since faded, the blue nylon frayed at the edges, but Jonah treated it like treasure. Every morning he'd touch it for luck. Every night he'd place it beneath his pillow like a charm to protect his dreams. It wasn't just hope that kept him going, it was duty. Rusty had protected him more times than Jonah could count. Now it was Jonah's turn to protect Rusty in the only way he knew how, by remembering him. His classmates didn't understand. When they talked about football or TV shows, Jonah stayed quiet. When they invited him to birthday parties, he politely declined. At recess, he often sat alone near the school's chain-link fence, sketching little pictures of dogs in the corners of his notebooks. But he wasn't sad in the way people assumed. He wasn't lost. He was holding on. Like an old man tracing the edges of a faded photograph, Jonah carried Rusty's memory with quiet dignity. One afternoon, Melanie found him seated at the kitchen table, another letter half finished. She hesitated in the doorway, then asked gently, "Sweetheart, why do you keep writing, even after all this time?" Jonah didn't look up right away. He tapped the eraser of his pencil against the wood for a moment, thinking. Then, in a small voice that carried the weight of something much older than 9 years, he answered, "Because if Rusty's still alive, and I stop believing, then who's gonna believe for him?" Melanie had no response. Her throat tightened, and she reached for his shoulder, giving it a soft squeeze. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. From that day on, she stopped questioning the letters. She bought extra stamps. She helped look up new shelters online. On the rare days she had off, she'd drive him to the post office herself. They never talked about giving up again. And so the weeks went by, marked not by holidays or school tests, but by the quiet ritual of Jonah's Sunday letters. They became part of him, an extension of his love, his memory, his unshakable hope. He didn't know if any shelter was reading them. He didn't know if Rusty was even still alive. But he believed that somehow, through some invisible thread, Rusty could feel the words reaching him. He believed in the power of remembering, of refusing to let go, of showing up for someone even when the world told you it was time to move on. Jonah didn't just miss his dog, he knew his dog. And that kind of knowing didn't fade. It simply waited for the day a letter might find the right hands. For the moment a dog might hear his name again and remember the boy who never stopped believing. Walter hadn't planned to write back. For weeks now, the letters had arrived like clockwork, each one a tiny, folded miracle waiting at the door. Every note was written with a kind of earnestness he hadn't seen in decades, each sentence carrying a thread of memory, every paragraph drenched in unwavering hope. And every time Walter read them aloud to Rusty, something inside the old Pitbull came alive again. But on the sixth letter, something shifted. It was a cold Tuesday morning, and Walter had just finished feeding the dogs when he found the envelope tucked under the mat again. The handwriting was the same, childlike, steady, but the letter inside was different. "Dear Rusty," it began, "do you remember the scar on your leg? You got it because of me. I was dumb and went too close to the woods, and that snake came out of nowhere. You didn't even bark. You just jumped in front of me. I thought you were going to die. But you didn't. You stayed. You always stayed. I hope you're still staying somewhere." Walter read the letter 3 times. The words echoed through him, stirring places in his heart he'd long forgotten. It wasn't just the content, it was the absolute certainty in them. This boy knew Rusty, not vaguely, not in the way of someone grasping at hope. He knew him down to the scar, down to the story that pain had come from. Walter sat at his desk for a long while that afternoon. The letter lay in front of him, and beside it, a Polaroid he'd taken of Rusty last week, lying in his kennel, head slightly turned, eyes soft but still guarded. He stared at the photo, then at the letter, then back again. And then, for the first time in over a decade, he pulled out a sheet of his own stationery. He kept it simple. "Dear friend, we believe this might be the dog you've been writing to. His name here is Rusty. I've attached a photo. There's a scar on his back left leg. Faint, but still there. Do you think this could be him?" Walter Mays, Golden Haven Shelter. He printed it in large, careful letters, not wanting the boy to struggle reading it. He tucked the photo into the envelope, sealed it gently, and mailed it the same day. The reply arrived 2 days later, but it wasn't in the form of a letter. It came through a phone call. Walter was sweeping the hallway when the front desk phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Most calls to the shelter were routine. Food deliveries, lost pet reports, volunteers calling in late. But something told him to pick up. "Golden Haven Shelter, this is Walter," he said. There was a pause on the other end. Then the soft, trembling voice of a woman came through. "Hi, my name's Melanie Reynolds. I think you found my son's dog." Walter's breath caught. He leaned on the counter, suddenly very still. "He's been writing letters," she continued, voice cracking. "Every week, for months. I didn't think... I hoped, but... He got your letter yesterday. He cried for a full hour. He kept pointing at the photo saying, 'It's him, Mom, that's my Rusty.' And then he showed me the scar on the dog's leg. He remembered exactly where it was. I hadn't thought about that day in years, but Jonah, he never forgot." Walter swallowed hard, unsure what to say. The emotion in the woman's voice was thick and real, the kind that wraps around your ribs and doesn't let go. She continued, her voice softer now. "I didn't believe it at first. I didn't want to get his hopes up. But I looked at that photo, Mr. Mays, and it is him. I can see it in his eyes. I don't know how we found each other again, but thank you. Thank you for not giving up on him." Walter felt a lump in his throat, the kind that comes not from sadness, but from something deeper, something like grace. He looked down the hallway toward Kennel 4, where Rusty lay curled on his blanket. "Your boy never gave up," Walter said quietly. "All I did was read his words out loud." There was a long pause. Then Melanie asked, "Can we come? Is it okay if we visit?" "Of course," Walter said. "Come any time." Melanie took the rest of the week off from the hospital, first time in years she'd ever used her vacation days. She packed an overnight bag for her and Jonah, filled a small cooler with snacks, and printed the directions Walter had emailed over. It would take them nearly 5 hours to get there, but Jonah didn't mind. He sat in the back seat with Rusty's collar clutched to his chest, eyes bright with anticipation. As the miles passed, Melanie watched him in the rearview mirror. Something in him had lit up, something she hadn't seen since the day they lost Rusty. For the first time in months, he hummed along with the radio. He told her stories again. He smiled. And she realized then, with absolute clarity, what she hadn't understood before. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about the space Rusty had held in Jonah's heart, the way he had taught her son loyalty, protection, and the kind of love that doesn't fade with time. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a return to faith, a return to connection, a return to the idea that maybe, just maybe, miracles still happened, especially when a child believes enough for the whole world. The sky was overcast when the Reynolds' old sedan pulled into the gravel lot at Golden Haven Shelter. The building stood quietly at the edge of a frozen field, its wooden sign slightly weathered but proud. In the back seat, Jonah sat perfectly still, his small hands clutching Rusty's faded blue collar. His heart thudded like a drum against his ribs. After all the letters, after all the waiting, this was it. Melanie turned off the engine and looked back at him. "You okay, baby?" Jonah nodded, but his voice caught in his throat. He couldn't speak. He didn't trust his voice not to break. Walter was already waiting at the door. He'd been pacing for the last 20 minutes, unsure whether to be nervous or hopeful. Rusty had been quiet all morning. He hadn't eaten much. Something in the air had changed the moment Walter told him, "Someone's coming today. I think it's someone you'll know." Now, as the mother and son stepped out of the car, Walter opened the door and gave them a small, almost shy smile. "Jonah?" he asked. The boy nodded. Walter held the door wide and led them in. No one spoke. The shelter was unusually quiet, the other dogs strangely subdued, as if sensing that this moment was not theirs. As they approached the back hallway, Walter slowed. "He's down here," he said softly, nodding toward Kennel 4. Jonah walked forward, his legs trembling. Every step felt like a memory. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and dry kibble. Faint barks echoed in the distance. The walls were lined with leashes, blankets, and supplies, but Jonah saw none of it. He was looking ahead, past everything, to the gate at the very end. And then, there he was. Rusty, lying on his blanket, head down, ears relaxed. Just another quiet dog in a long corridor of forgotten animals. For a moment, Jonah froze. What if Rusty didn't remember? What if he had changed too much? What if the letters hadn't been enough? Then he stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Rusty, it's me, buddy. It's Jonah." Rusty didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his ears twitched. His head lifted, his nose twitched once, twice, and his eyes locked on the boy standing just feet away. It was as if time folded in on itself. In a heartbeat, Rusty sprang to his feet. His tail began to wag, not wildly, but with purpose. He let out a sound, a whimper, sharp and guttural, like a cry torn from deep inside. "Rusty!" Jonah gasped, tears already streaming down his face. The dog pushed against the gate, pawing at the bars, whining, pacing in frantic circles. Walter fumbled with the latch, hands trembling, and as soon as the gate opened, Rusty rushed forward. Not in a blur, not in chaos, but with urgency, with recognition. He stopped just short of Jonah, as if asking for permission. Then the boy dropped to his knees, arms wide, and Rusty leapt into them. It was not graceful. It was not quiet. It was desperate and overwhelming and full of noise, snuffling, licking, tail-thumping, breathless sobbing. Rusty's head pressed against Jonah's chest like he was trying to disappear into it. Jonah buried his face in Rusty's neck, inhaling the scent of dusty fur and dog food and home. "Hey, it's okay," Jonah whispered, voice cracking. I told you I'd find you. I told you. Melanie stood a few steps behind, one hand over her mouth, the other clutching the door frame for balance. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent but unstoppable. Walter couldn't move. He watched, his heart pounding, as the boy and the dog reunited like twin pieces of something whole. And in that instant, all the years fell away. His losses, his regrets, the aching space where his own dog, Axel, used to live. The weight of it hit him hard. He turned away, wiping at his eyes with the back of a calloused hand. But it was no use. The tears came anyway, hot, unexpected, and strangely cleansing. Staff from the shelter had gathered quietly behind them. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. They stood still, like witnesses to something sacred. A miracle, because what else could you call it? A boy who never gave up, a dog who never forgot, and a thread of belief so strong it held across time, across distance, across silence. After a long while, when the sobs had quieted and the licking had slowed, Jonah reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded note. It was the last letter. He handed it to Walter. "I wrote it last night," Jonah said. "I wanted him to hear it here." Walter nodded. His voice caught in his throat. "Would you like me to read it to him?" Jonah shook his head. "I want him to have it." Then he turned back to Rusty, still pressed close. He held the letter gently against the dog's chest and whispered, "Tell Rusty, I'm here, and we're going home." Rusty let out a soft, satisfied grunt and leaned harder into the boy, as if to say, "I know." And from that moment on, Rusty didn't look back again. Jonah never wrote another letter, not because he gave up hope, but because hope had finally come home. From the day Rusty leapt into his arms at the shelter, the world seemed to shift. The distance between longing and fulfillment collapsed in that single unforgettable moment. And just like that, the ritual that had carried Jonah through months of sadness was no longer necessary. The pages had done their job. The words had made their way home. Now, Jonah and Rusty had their own new rituals. Every morning after breakfast, Jonah would tug on his sneakers while Rusty circled excitedly at the door. The collar, newly cleaned, though still faded, clicked into place with the same satisfying snap it had made years ago, and together they'd race out into the fields behind their house, feet and paws pounding across open earth and early morning dew. It was their sacred hour. Jonah didn't talk much during these runs. He didn't have to. The rhythm of Rusty's breath beside him, the sound of paws meeting dirt, the way the dog looked at him with complete trust, these were better than any letter. The silence they shared wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things they both remembered but didn't need to say. Neighbors watched from porches, quietly stunned. They had seen Jonah's slow withdrawal after Rusty vanished, how the boy had changed, grown quieter, lonelier. And now they saw the change again, only this time in reverse. Jonah laughed more. He rode his bike again. He even joined the neighborhood kids in their weekend games, always with Rusty lying nearby, head resting on his paws, keeping watch. And Rusty? Rusty had come back to life. Gone was the skittish dog who flinched at every sound. He moved with confidence now, tail held higher, eyes brighter. He still didn't bark much. He'd always been more watcher than talker. But he no longer curled into himself at night. He sprawled across Jonah's bed like he belonged there, because he did. One afternoon, Melanie walked into the living room to find Jonah asleep on the couch, one arm draped over Rusty's chest. In his other hand was the old collar Jonah had kept all those months, the one Rusty had worn when he was just a puppy. She stood in the doorway for a long time, hand over her heart, tears in her eyes. Hope, it seemed, wasn't just for children. Back at Golden Haven Shelter, things were changing, too. Walter had kept every letter. He hadn't intended to. At first, he'd simply placed them in a drawer, unsure what to do with them. But as the weeks passed and the letters grew in number, He realized they were more than paper and ink. They were history, proof, a testament to a bond most people never understood or never took the time to believe in. After Jonah and Rusty's reunion, Walter took the letters and carefully mounted each one in protective sleeves. He found an old bulletin board in storage, sanded and stained it, and hung it on the wall in the shelter's front lobby. Above the board, in carved wood, he placed a sign, "Rusty's Corner, for every dog still waiting, and every soul still believing." People noticed. Visitors stopped to read the letters. Some stood there for 20 minutes, moved to tears by the slow unfolding of a child's love through the pages. Others left quietly, eyes wet, hands in pockets, as if holding something fragile they didn't want to break. The story spread quickly. A local journalist wrote a feature on Jonah and Rusty, and soon the shelter's phone began ringing nonstop. People wanted to know more. They asked if Rusty was really a Pitbull because he didn't look dangerous in the photos. Walter would chuckle and say, "He's dangerous all right, dangerously loyal." And something miraculous began to happen. Dogs that had been overlooked for months, especially older dogs, especially pit bulls, started getting adopted. People came in and asked, "Do you have a Rusty?" And what they meant was, "Do you have a dog that's been waiting just like I've been waiting to love one?" Walter's heart swelled each time another cage emptied. Hope had taken root, and it was blooming. Jonah and Melanie returned to the shelter once more, weeks after the reunion. Jonah wanted to show Walter a framed photo of him and Rusty running in the field, and he brought a special gift, the final unopened letter he'd written, the one he never needed to send. "I want you to keep this one," Jonah said, "for the next kid who has to wait." Walter read it later that night. His hands trembled by the end. It said, "Dear Rusty, I don't have to ask if you're okay anymore because now I can see it every day. I don't have to wonder what you're dreaming because you sleep right next to me. I don't have to say I miss you because you're here, but just so you know, I never stopped believing. Jonah." That night, Walter left the shelter with a lighter step. The wind was cold, but he didn't feel it. His breath puffed in the air like smoke as he walked to his truck, and for the first time in years, he hummed an old tune his wife used to love. Because sometimes, belief isn't loud. It's quiet. It's steady. It's a boy writing letters to a dog. It's a dog waiting by the door. It's an old man finding purpose again in the sound of paws on tile and laughter down a hallway. And back in Jonah's bedroom, the boy lay under a quilt, fast asleep. Rusty was curled beside him, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the boy's breath. Jonah's arm rested across the dog's back, and in his small hand was Rusty's first collar, the one he'd never let go of. In the soft stillness, Jonah stirred, eyes barely open. He looked at Rusty, whispered with a sleepy smile, "I told you I'd never stop believing." Rusty sighed, content, and nestled closer. And in that room, in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Home. If this story touched your heart even just a little, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Vale Marks. Your support helps us reach 1,000 subscribers, a milestone that fuels our passion to bring you more heartfelt, meaningful stories like this one. Remember, as Fred Rogers once said, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. Rusty and Jonah's journey reminds us that love, no matter how small, can light the darkest path home. Let us know in the comments, have you ever waited for someone you loved to return? Thank you for being here. Until the next story, keep believing. Because sometimes, that's all it takes.